In the brutal cold of a desert POW camp on Christmas Eve, 60 Italian prisoners planned an act of emotional defiance. They knew the American guards were armed and hostile, but what they didn't anticipate was that their song of home would bring their enemies to a quiet, overwhelming surrender. The dry, cold, alien landscape of the Arizona desert on December 24, 1944. The silence of the night was broken only by the crunch of Sergeant Thomas "Tom" Hayes' boots on the gravel patrol path, a sound that felt brittle and unforgiving in the vast, empty darkness. This was Camp Florence, a prisoner of war facility built to house thousands of Italian soldiers captured half a world away, and tonight the holiday season felt less like Christmas Eve and more like a cruel, celestial joke. Inside Barracks F, 60 Italian prisoners sat on their bunks, the iron cots offering meager comfort against the chill that bled up from the concrete floor. Among them was 22-year-old Giovanni Rossi, a former philosophy and opera student from Florence. His uniform was faded American khaki, dyed brown to denote his prisoner status, a constant, ugly reminder of his lost identity. Giovanni closed his eyes, desperately trying to conjure the smell of cypress and warm olive oil from his childhood, the scent of warmth that permeated his mother's kitchen on Via Ghibellina. But the reality was the persistent, sterile stench of disinfectant and stale sweat, and the only sound was the low, uncomfortable shifting of other men. Giovanni had been told by his commanding officers that capture by the Americans meant certain mistreatment. Instead, he found only monotonous order. The United States Army, for all its might, seemed determined to adhere to the rigid rules of the Geneva Conventions with a kind of practical, bureaucratic obsession. The guards were not brutal. They were simply exhausted, bored, and utterly impersonal. They were custodians, not tormentors. They provided 3 meals a day, adequate space, and even allowed the men to organize small, censored mail exchanges. Yet this lack of open malice felt almost more unsettling than outright cruelty. It was the quiet confidence of a nation so focused on logistics that it treated its enemies like expensive inventory. On the other side of the barbed wire, Sergeant Hayes felt the same weary, grinding isolation. He was a long way from his wife and 2 young children in Ohio, and the sight of these men, enemy soldiers, was a constant, bitter reminder of the distance. He saw not the face of fascism, but rows of displaced men who were merely delaying his own return home. They were a necessary, guarded chore. Tonight, as the clock ticked toward midnight, Hayes could think only of the familiar sound of carols and the warmth of a fireplace. Here, there was only the cold, dry air and the distant skeletal outline of the fence. He paused at the edge of the perimeter, looking out at the silent barracks. He knew what the date meant to them, just as he knew what it meant to him. It was a date that demanded a brief, desperate pause in the war. Giovanni looked up at the one small, high window of the barracks. The moon cast a weak, dusty light, illuminating the crude sketches he had been hiding, a drawing of a small, empty church. He missed the music more than anything, the rich, booming sounds of the holiday mass. He knew that for all the structure and order the Americans provided, tonight the cultural isolation would become unbearable. He had to find a way to honor the season, to remind himself and his comrades that they were men, not merely prisoners. But to ask for anything beyond the regulated routine felt like inviting disaster. As the temperature continued to plummet, Giovanni felt the fear rise, the fear that tomorrow would be just another day of empty routine, devoid of the human connection that Christmas demanded. The thought of that silence was almost more frightening than any punishment. The silence inside Barracks F was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the collective acknowledgement of 60 men who knew exactly what the calendar date meant to their souls. Every man avoided eye contact, aware of the shared grief hanging over them. For Giovanni Rossi, the tension was unbearable. He remembered the posters depicting American forces as inhuman captors, but the reality was far more nuanced. The American approach to its 400,000 Axis prisoners was not rooted in vengeance but in practical adherence to international law. The United States had moral capital to uphold and a massive logistical operation to manage, and a well-behaved prisoner was simply more efficient. This was the kindness of pragmatism, clean barracks, medical care, and food, not out of charity, but because it reduced the need for guards and prevented insurrection. To Giovanni, this systematic decency was the greatest shock of all. Giovanni often retreated into the one thing the guards could not control: his memory and his art. Carefully hoarding slivers of charcoal and flattened scraps of packaging paper, he worked furtively beneath his thin blanket. His hands, once trained to glide across a piano, now moved to sketch the scenes he missed most. He was creating a secret visual sanctuary against the sterile monotony of the camp. One afternoon, Giovanni was caught. He was finishing a drawing of a nativity scene when Private Johnson, a young, nervous guard on his first deployment, stopped at the window. The private didn't shout. He simply stared, transfixed by the artistry. When Private Johnson finally moved on, he didn't confiscate the drawing or report the unauthorized use of materials. But Sergeant Hayes, who saw everything, was not so careless. He walked into the barracks later that evening, his posture rigid. He didn't look at the drawing, but his eyes were locked on Giovanni. "Rossi," he said, his voice flat and low. "No unauthorized materials. We maintain order here, do you understand?" Hayes' refusal wasn't personal. It was military. He could not permit any deviation from the rules, especially one involving deep emotion. The unspoken request was simply too human for a prison camp. Giovanni immediately hid the drawing, his heart sinking. He understood that sentiment was a dangerous contraband. Yet as the sun finally slipped below the distant, jagged mountains, coating the barbed wire in a brief, agonizing moment of gold, Giovanni felt a desperate resolve harden inside him. He knew he had to attempt the unthinkable, to ask for permission to use that voice, regardless of the risk of severe penalty. He would find a way to break the silence. This year, the silence would not win. Giovanni, having finished his meager meal of bread and thin, unseasoned soup, stepped out of line with a calculated swiftness. It was an act of defiance, not against the military, but against the apathy of captivity, and it pulled all 60 men's eyes in the mess hall toward him as if drawn by an invisible wire. Sergeant Hayes stood near the door, overseeing the collection of tin plates, his face etched with fatigue. He was an officer of routine, and Giovanni's departure from that routine was a silent challenge. Giovanni approached the sergeant slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, every muscle tense beneath the coarse fabric of his uniform. He knew this single interaction could result in serious penalty, a loss of privileges, or worse, solitary confinement. Yet he advanced, fixing his gaze just below the sergeant's eye line, a gesture of military respect that he hoped would override his status as an enemy. "Sergeant," Giovanni began, forcing his English to sound as steady and clear as possible. "Permesso, please." Hayes waited, his hand pausing on a stack of plates. His eyes, the color of desert dust, were guarded and unreadable. "It is Vigilia di Natale, Christmas Eve," Giovanni continued. "We ask for one thing, before lights out, permission for singing, one song, a little singing." Hayes listened, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He saw the genuine, desperate appeal. Singing could be used as a code, a distraction, or worse. The American military ran on cold calculation, and singing carols was not on the manifest. "Rossi," Hayes stated, his voice flat and loud enough for a few nearby guards to hear. "Regulations. No unauthorized assembly. No disturbances after 2000 hours. That is the rule. Any break in discipline this close to the holidays will result in a disciplinary transfer, Rossi. Don't push this." Giovanni had expected this. He took a calculated risk, stepping slightly closer. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, letting the name hang in the air for a moment. "I know the rules, but tonight we are not soldiers. We are men who remember home. I am opera student, sir, not a combatant. I ask this not as prisoner to guard, but as man to man. The voice, it is what we have left. One song, 5 minutes, please." He didn't mention his wife or his children, but his tone implied the profound loneliness that spanned the distance between Ohio and Arizona. Hayes looked at the men behind Giovanni, their faces pale, watching in silence. He saw not the uniform of an enemy, but the gaunt features of displacement. For a moment, the vast, cold space of the mess hall vanished, replaced by the ghost of his own family's living room, filled with the warmth of his wife's familiar smile. The request, born of an enemy's humanity, landed heavily in the center of his own hidden grief. Hayes turned away without a reply, leaving Giovanni standing alone in the echoing silence. The sergeant's non-answer was terrifying, yet it also held a thin, fragile thread of possibility. Hayes stood by the perimeter fence, watching the desert sun bleed its last, agonizing light into the horizon, the reds and purples a vivid contrast to the endless, dusty brown. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a worn, creased photograph of his wife and two small children standing beside a modestly decorated Christmas tree. The warmth of that memory fought against the cold logic of regulation and duty. Hayes was a man whose entire life was governed by order, and the Italian prisoner's request for a carol was an emotional complication he neither wanted nor knew how to process. He walked the perimeter twice, his boots chewing the gravel path, before he finally made his way back to the barracks area. He found Giovanni waiting near the entry door. 5 minutes, Hayes stated, his voice barely a murmur. One song. Inside the barracks, lights off. Any noise, any signal, any break in discipline, and you'll spend New Year's in the hole. Understood? He didn't wait for an answer, instead giving a quick, almost imperceptible nod and walking away. It was a permission granted in grudging silence, an act of humanity disguised as a tactical concession, a concession made only after the memory of his own family became unbearable. The news spread through Barracks F like an electric current. The men sat upright, their focus intense. Giovanni knew they had been given not a privilege but a window of opportunity. He gathered the 20 men he knew had singing experience. Their challenge was immense, performing music of layered complexity without any instruments or sheet music, relying entirely on memory and his direction. Giovanni was a natural conductor, and in the center of the barracks he began to work. He used a broom handle as his baton, tapping quiet rhythms on the wooden frame of a cot to establish tempo. He divided the men into 3 sections, baritone, tenor, and a rough bass line. They rehearsed in hushed whispers, reconstructing the intricate harmonies of the carols from the fragments of their collective past. The work transformed them. They were no longer prisoners. They were an ensemble, bound by a purpose more noble than their captivity. As they quietly perfected a difficult chord, achieving a resonance and artistic quality that seemed impossible in the cold wooden structure, the barracks shifted. Giovanni moved from man to man, correcting a pitch here, adding a dynamic there. He was turning the sterile prison block into a sacred space, readying the men for their performance. As the prearranged time drew near, the men settled onto their cots. They had reconstructed a small piece of home in the heart of the Arizona desert, a space defined not by the guards' boundaries, but by the power of their combined voices. The tension was almost unbearable, a blend of military precision and artistic expectation, all resting on the signal from the silent American guard. The smell was the first true shock, not the usual thin scent of boiled cabbage or stale coffee, but the rich aroma of coffee, roasted beef, and a strange, unfamiliar blend of cinnamon and cloves. This scent drifted through the camp just before the evening meal, a smell too rich, too generous for a prison. This unexpected abundance was the United States Army's second nod to the season. Tonight, the mess hall was transformed by loaves of white bread, steaming plates of roast meat, mashed potatoes thick with butter, and even a modest, sweet fruit pastry. It was a caloric, edible contradiction to the idea of wartime rationing and enemy deprivation. The Italian men filed in, their initial reaction one of profound, suspicious silence. They were used to thin soup and ration cards. This level of abundance felt like a cruel joke. It took several tense, silent minutes before the first man tentatively lifted his fork. Then, slowly, the others followed. The speed with which hunger defeated fear was a silent commentary on the truth of their former hardships. Giovanni ate slowly, carefully savoring the flavor of the roast beef. He managed to secure an extra crust of the white bread, tucking it away in his tunic pocket like a precious jewel. He knew the physical sustenance was important, but the moral sustenance, the fact that their captors provided this comfort, was what truly unsettled their years of political conditioning. Sergeant Hayes stood by the serving line, ensuring order, his face giving away nothing. He watched the men's faces. He saw the flicker of disbelief, the cautious joy, and the immediate, powerful sense of relief that comes with an unexpected gift. He realized that this act of logistical generosity was doing more to demoralize the enemy's ideology than any interrogation ever could. It was an overwhelming display of confidence. America had so much, it could even feed its enemies well. The air in the barracks afterward was thick with anticipation. The tension had shifted from fear of the guards to the quiet, shared hope for the song. The meal was over, the rules had been bent, and the night was now dedicated to the music that might, for 5 precious minutes, transport them all far beyond the cold, dry walls of the desert fortress. At precisely 2000 hours, the floodlight on the nearest guard tower flickered once briefly before plunging Barracks F and the surrounding perimeter into a deep shadow. It was the prearranged signal, the hesitant nod of permission from the American command, and a sudden, profound hush fell over the entire camp. Inside the dark barracks, Giovanni Rossi stood in the center aisle, holding his broom-handled baton. He closed his eyes and, with perfect pitch and quiet, booming resonance, began the opening notes of the carol, Tu scendi dalle stelle. You come down from the stars. The full force of the baritone and tenor sections rose in powerful, disciplined harmony. The sound was instantly pure, shattering the walls of the barracks and the image of demoralized captives. The men singing were transported back to the stone chapels of their childhoods. The music poured out of the barracks, settling against the high perimeter fence. The effect on the American guards was immediate and unexpected. Patrols stopped dead mid-step. Junior guards froze. Every movement in the camp ceased. Sergeant Hayes, walking the perimeter 100 feet away, felt the bass notes rumble up from the ground and penetrate the thick soles of his boots. He stopped dead, leaning subtly against a wooden post, his rifle held loosely at his side. The music was a shock. It was organized, beautiful, and utterly foreign to the monotony of their duty. It forced the Americans to see the men inside the wire not as unit numbers or enemy combatants, but as artists, as men capable of creating something profound and complex. The language was Italian, incomprehensible to most of the guards, but the melody was instantly recognizable as a song of devotion and deep longing. It was the first time since the war began that the enemy had reached across the wire, not with hostility, but with an overwhelming, unexpected wave of culture and emotional truth. For 3 minutes, the raw power of the combined voices was the only reality in the Arizona desert, momentarily eclipsing the war that had brought them together. As the final soaring note of the Italian carol faded, the silence that followed was more profound than any noise. Giovanni lowered his broom handle. He paused for the agreed-upon moment, and then, using the silence as a bridge, he lifted his voice again for the second, more dangerous piece. The final soaring note of the Italian carol faded into the vast, cold Arizona night. The 5-minute time limit was dangerously close to expiring, yet Giovanni felt compelled to offer one last, desperate bridge to the enemy. He raised his voice again, starting softly in German. He began the opening lines of Stille Nacht, Silent Night, its original tongue, a neutral, universal song of peace and longing. The choice was deliberate. Then, seamlessly, the Italian prisoners transitioned, weaving the melody into the Italian lyrics of Astro del Ciel, Star of the Sky. They sang it softly this time, a delicate, almost whispered offering of prayer. For Sergeant Hayes, leaning on the perimeter post in the cold, the transformation was jarring. The initial song had been beautiful but foreign. This one hit him like a physical blow. He recognized the melody immediately, realizing that the men inside the barracks were singing his song, the song of his home. The music functioned as an invisible, acoustic cable transmitting not doctrine, but shared human yearning. Hayes was no longer guarding prisoners of war. He was listening to fathers and sons who missed their families just as deeply as he missed his own. The song stripped away the uniforms and the rank. Hayes felt his military posture begin to soften, his hands loosening their grip on the rifle. The emotional tide of the music was overwhelming the structure of the prison. This universal melody of quiet contemplation was setting the stage for a private confrontation no guard could avoid. Sergeant Hayes stood alone near the camp perimeter, his face hidden in the deep shadow cast by the guard tower, the cold metal of the post a grounding presence against the emotional chaos rising inside him. The melody of Silent Night, sung softly in the darkness by his designated enemies, was piercing his military shell. It was not the sound of war, it was the sound of home. Hayes was transported back 2 years, to the last Christmas he had spent in Ohio. He could see the yellow light spilling from the parlor window, hear his mother singing, and feel the weight of his young daughter. That life felt impossibly distant, separated from him by thousands of miles of ocean and the terrible reality of the global conflict. The music exposed a profound, raw vulnerability. Hayes had spent months viewing these Italian prisoners through the lens of duty. But the sound of their harmonies stripped away the uniform and the label of enemy, revealing instead the deep, shared sorrow of displaced men. The yearning in Giovanni's voice, the central baritone that held the entire chorus together, was indistinguishable from Hayes's own heartache. The war had stolen their peace, fractured their families, and exiled them all, the guard and the guarded, to this cold, dusty corner of Arizona. Hayes felt a tremor run through his large frame. He was not crying out of pity for the Italians. He was weeping quietly for the immense collective cost of the conflict, a cost measured in the stolen moments of peace that bound him to the men inside the wire. It was a realization that the men singing possessed a humanity identical to his own. The song was a quiet, overwhelming demand to acknowledge their shared existence. He covered his eyes with one hand, his posture momentarily crumbling under the immense weight of the truth the music revealed. For these few moments on a cold desert night, the most powerful force in the camp was the simple, universal melody of a lullaby. It was an involuntary moment of reconciliation. Hayes slowly forced his composure back. The moment passed, leaving him feeling irrevocably changed, and knowing he could never view the men inside the barracks as mere inventory again. The final soft chord of the hymn faded into the immense, cold darkness. The men inside Barracks F held their breath, waiting for the expected harsh reprimand. But the shouting never came. Instead, the entire camp remained enveloped in a heavy, profound silence. The American guards stood frozen, the silence itself acting as a profound acknowledgement. Sergeant Hayes slowly pushed himself away from the perimeter post. The man inside the uniform was fundamentally changed. He walked deliberately toward Barracks F at a quickened pace, not to issue a penalty, but to close the incident with finality. He moved quickly, his boots crunching on the gravel. Giovanni Rossi stood by the small, dusty window, waiting. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the thin, glass-paneled opening. Hayes paused directly opposite the window, and in that moment of acute tension, he did not speak. He simply lifted his hand in a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a single, fleeting nod of the head. It was an act of recognition that transcended rank, language, and the military conflict that separated them. The nod was a thank you for the song, an acknowledgement of the shared moment of grace. Giovanni understood immediately. The tension in his chest released, replaced by an overwhelming sense of validation. The rules had not been broken. They had been temporarily suspended by the sheer undeniable weight of the human heart. Hayes held the nod for only a second longer, then walked away, resuming his patrol. But everything had changed. Inside the barracks, the men sat down. They knew their physical status was unchanged. They were still prisoners. Yet for the first time, they felt they had been treated as fully realized men with souls that yearned for beauty. The war was still raging, but for one night, the human heart of the Arizona camp had profoundly and irrevocably shifted. The sun rose on Christmas Day, 1944. The camp routine resumed, but a profound, unstated shift had taken place. The immediate impact was subtle but noticeable. Sergeant Hayes returned to his duties, but his interactions with the Italian men were marked by a new, almost weary respect. He saw the men now not as enemy ciphers, but as individuals with a profound capacity for emotion. Giovanni Rossi knew his voice had done more than just soothe his comrades. It had communicated a truth to their captors. A few days later, Giovanni wrote a long letter to his mother in Florence. He did not describe the powerful weeping of the American Guard. Instead, he focused on the emotional aftermath. He wrote of the unexpected generosity of the holiday meal, and most importantly, of the profound silence that followed the singing, a moment when the war was utterly absent. His letter reached his family, fueling their hope and planting a powerful seed of a different, kinder America in a Europe consumed by devastation. He would later learn that thousands of other Axis prisoners were sending similar letters home, becoming unwitting ambassadors of American decency. These small, verifiable acts of fairness were quietly dismantling years of authoritarian propaganda. The war ended. Giovanni was eventually repatriated, returning to a Florence that was scarred but recovering. He successfully resumed his career, eventually becoming a respected baritone in European opera houses. Yet the memory of that Christmas Eve in the desert remained his most profound performance. Sergeant Thomas Hayes, too, returned home to Ohio, but the sound of Silent Night was forever altered for him. It was no longer simply a carol of childhood memory. It was the sound of a private war ending in a moment of shared human sorrow. He carried the awareness that he had witnessed one of the war's deepest ironies, that true victory was not only achieved on the battlefield, but also in the moments when shared humanity was allowed to transcend enmity. The final, unexpected payoff came years later. In the late 1950s, while Hayes was on a modest European trip with his wife, he attended a performance at a small, elegant opera house in Florence. The star baritone's name was familiar, Giovanni Rossi. Hayes sat in the third row, watching the man's powerful performance, struck by the maturity and passion in his voice. After the show, he waited by the stage door. When Giovanni emerged, Hayes approached. "Mr. Rossi," Hayes said, his voice husky with emotion. "I don't expect you to remember me. My name is Thomas Hayes. I was a guard at Camp Florence. Christmas, 1944. Giovanni's face softened into a deep, knowing warmth. He reached out and grasped Hayes' hand, recognizing the weariness in the eyes. "Sergeant," Giovanni said, the word now carrying only respect and history. "I remember the silence that followed the song, and I remember your nod." In that moment, two former adversaries, separated by rank, ideology, and an ocean, stood together in the gentle light of a European city. They had bridged the vast, impersonal distance of war with nothing more than a melody and a silent acknowledgement. It was a testament that even the harshest circumstances could yield moments of grace, and that sometimes the most enduring legacy of a global conflict is found in the quiet, compassionate acts of ordinary men. If this story of shared humanity in the face of war resonated with you, please ensure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us uncover more of these lost, unforgettable moments in history.